When we flip on the TV, scroll through our feeds, or watch the news, we're constantly seeing portrayals of gender. But how do we even begin to unpack all that? How do we analyze it? And maybe more importantly, what happens when the audience stops just watching and starts creating? Let's get into it.
Okay, so this is really the big question we have to start with. Because if gender isn't some fixed biological fact, but something we perform, something we learn and repeat every day, then the media becomes this huge, powerful force in teaching us the script.
You know, feminist critics argue that these performances are anything but neutral. They often prop up a patriarchal system where power has traditionally been in the hands of men. And this gives us our very first critical lens for looking at media.
Right, so this core idea, that gender is a performance, is our foundation. It lets us see that media doesn't just hold a mirror up to reality, it's actively helping to build it.
So, with that in mind, let's look at how the first wave of feminist critique approached this. They pointed the finger directly at the media, at the movies, the TV shows, the ads, and said, hey, the way you're showing women here, it's a huge problem.
One of the most obvious issues was just being pushed to the sidelines. I mean, take a look at this 2009 study of popular video games. The chart says it all. A staggering 85% of characters were male. When you only make up 15% of the cast, you're not just underrepresented, you're basically an afterthought.
And listen, this isn't just in fantasy worlds. A huge global study of the news from 2015 found that women were less than a quarter of the people you saw or heard from. So the big takeaway here is that whether we're talking about games or the nightly news, women's voices have just been massively downplayed.
But it's not even just about the numbers. Sociologist Gay Tuchman came up with this really powerful term for it, symbolic annihilation. The idea is that the danger isn't just being invisible, it's being visible in only one super narrow way. It's when you're only ever shown as a wife or a mother, which effectively erases or annihilates your existence in every other part of life.
And this brings us to what is maybe the most famous theory in this whole discussion, Laura Mulvey's male gaze. Her argument was that classic movies are literally built from the ground up for a male viewer's pleasure. The camera itself forces all of us, men and women, to see female characters as passive objects to be looked at, while the male hero is the active one, the one driving the story forward.
But of course, things didn't stay the same. By the 90s and 2000s, the media landscape started to change. We started seeing all these new, apparently empowered female characters. But the question is, were these new characters really breaking the old rules or just giving them a new coat of paint?
You know the shift I'm talking about. The old domestic goddess trope was out, and in her place came this new archetype, the glamorous, financially independent, sexually assertive career woman. Think Sex and the City. On the surface, it looks like a massive step forward, right?
So, we're all good now? Problem solved? Well, not so fast. Critics started asking pretty quickly if this new woman was genuinely free, or if this was just a different kind of trap.
Critic Angela McRobbie called this a post-feminist masquerade. She argued that, yeah, sure, these characters have careers and their own money, but their lives still seem to revolve around buying the right shoes, looking good for men, and ultimately finding the one. And this new ideal was also incredibly narrow, almost always white, straight, and upper middle class, leaving a whole lot of other women's experiences completely out of the picture.
You know, this whole thing where so many female stories still end up circling back to men? It led to the creation of this simple but brilliant little diagnostic tool, the Bechdel test. It just has 3 simple rules. Now, it's not a measure of whether a movie is good or feminist, but you would be shocked at how many major films fail it. It just really highlights how rarely we see women's relationships with each other as being central to the story.
But hang on, what if we've been looking at this from the wrong angle? What if the meaning isn't just locked inside the movie or the TV show? What if it's about what the audience does with it? This is where the whole conversation just flips on its head. Check out this quote from Joe Kermes. It's kind of provocative, right? It suggests that a lot of the early analysis treated audiences like they were helpless victims, like they needed a critic to swoop in and save them from bad media because they couldn't see the problems for themselves.
Which leads us to this massive question. Are we really just passive sponges, just soaking up whatever messages the media throws at us? Or are we active thinking people who interpret, argue with, and use media for our own reasons?
Well, when researchers actually started talking to audiences, what they found was fascinating.
Janice Radway discovered that for lots of women, the simple act of reading a romance novel was a quiet rebellion, a way to carve out time and space just for themselves. Ayn Ang found that fans of the soap opera Dallas weren't being brainwashed. They were finding real emotional pleasure in it. It turns out audiences weren't sponges at all. They were smart, they were critical, and they were active.
And that, of course, brings us right up to today, an era where the line between being a media consumer and a media producer has been completely and totally blurred. The key term for this new world is the prosumer. Part producer, part consumer. Thanks to digital technology, we aren't just watching the story anymore. We can now create, share, and remix it ourselves. We're all part of the show now.
And you know, this didn't just appear out of nowhere. You can trace a line from the DIY zines of the punk riot girl movement in the 90s to the massive online fan fiction communities of the 2000s, all the way to the TikToks and Instagram stories where young women today are building and sharing their own identities on their own terms.
So when you put it all together, we're left with these two essential lenses. On one hand, you have critical analysis, which looks at a piece of media and asks, what is the message here? But on the other hand, you have to look at audience agency and ask, okay, but what are people actually doing with this message? You really need both to see the full picture.
Which leaves us with a final, massive question for our time. In an age where anybody with a smartphone can be a media creator, where does the power really lie? Who truly gets to control the story of gender now?